Look at that! You came back for the life story. All right, good. So I'm gonna run through my life story, but as I already said, I'm ad-libbing this a bit. Cut me a little slack when I'm running through this because I'll be a little fumbly. So, I was born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, quickly moved to Pictou, grew up in Pictou, Nova Scotia. Came from a family that grew up on welfare. It was quite tough. And entered school at Dawson Elementary School. Now, when I first went to school, I was lucky enough to have a mother that taught me a bit of phonetic instruction before I went. Like PH says F, things like that. So when I went into primary, I had no issues. Grade 1, no issues. By grade 3, that's when it really started becoming apparent that I was having a lot of issues in school, mainly with reading. And because I couldn't read very well, I was acting out, being a little bit of a clown, but I was very athletic too, so I didn't hate school. Flash ahead another year to grade 4. The teachers recommended I go get my hearing checked. This is kind of like a reoccurring thing that happens today. And then I got sent all the way to Dartmouth to go see an education psychologist, where she put me through a bunch of tests that I thought were silly at the time. And she determined that I had no learning disability. But if she knew what I knew now, she would have understood that I was just in the 1/3 and I needed explicit phonetic instruction, which wasn't being offered in the schools at the time. So I kind of pushed my way through the next bunch of grades until I got to about grade 9. In grade 8, something kind of really good happened. At that point, I was way behind, just passing each grade, and I received little to no explicit phonetic instruction. So my reading was in the gutter, really. In grade 8, I went to the library with my mother, and I found a Star Wars book. This is a common story you'll hear about people who leveled up their reading. So I found a Star Wars novel. I love Star Wars, and I got the book. I sat down with the book and a dictionary, and I pushed my way through it. I had flashcards. I wrote new words on the flashcards. I had a notebook. I took notes. Through that experience of pushing through a few weeks with that book, I probably learned an extra 500 to 1,500 words. And that's what really pushed me up to higher grades in school, and it really pushed me to graduate. Without that, I just would have probably ended up quitting in high school or just passing with 50s. Either way, I wouldn't have got into university. So yes, I got into university. Pushed my way through high school, got into university. I shouldn't have been accepted, really. It was ridiculous. But I went to university my first year. I failed out. I had professors talk to me and kind of laughing at me about how low my writing ability was. I had almost no writing ability. In fact, even today, my writing ability is quite low because I've been concentrating on a few other things, but that's something I've been working on, and it can get better over time. Now, I failed out my first year university. I floundered for a year. Then I went to NSSC Community College, took carpentry. I even had trouble with the academics of carpentry, but I was always good at math, which is a common trait of these people who have a lot of trouble, a lot of trouble reading. So I got through the carpentry, and then I was like, you know what? Screw this, I'm going back to university. Went back to St. Mary's University and took only psychology courses with multiple choice tests because I could do those quite well. I couldn't write essays, I didn't take any of those courses. I couldn't do labs, things like that. I was always embarrassed to show my writing. So I got through it. Somehow over the next 3 years, and I took a couple summer courses, I pushed through and got a university degree, which was shocking because at this point, my reading was still terrible. I could barely write. I had a lot of trouble reading. I mean, I finished with a degree in psychology, and if someone asked me to spell psychology at the time, it was 50-50. It was that bad. So, what did I plan to do after that? Well, of course, I went to go teach English in Asia. I went to Taiwan to teach English. I started out there, terrible, didn't know what I was doing, had a really hard time. But I started working my way through classroom management, things like that, and I kind of became a good teacher, even though I still didn't have a great grasp on the English language or how to teach. And then because of that, I went down and started teaching at a kindergarten. That was an easier part, right? If you can't read, go to a kindergarten, you can have more fun, more playtime, and then you can, just teach them the basics. They're pretty easy, right? Wrong. They're not actually that easy. The basics are actually quite complicated, especially when you get into rules and you have to learn it all kind of perfectly to kind of get that end result of a great reader. So I was teaching them quite poorly and wrong for many years, but I did my best and I taught them just as well as other people at the time. So since I was in Taiwan, they speak Mandarin Chinese. And then I was like, I'm going to learn a little bit of Mandarin Chinese. So I studied their alphabet. It's called the Bapa Mafa. Now they have many characters in the Bapa Mafa, and each character has one sound. This is the problem that you run into with English, because English, like A, would be a, ah. Three sounds with a, ah, mat, table, father. There's three distinct sounds, and then when you combine A with other letters, you even get other sounds. And depending on where it is in the word, it'll also have another sound. If it's in the middle of a syllable, the end of a syllable, yada yada. We're not taught any of this in our schools. And if there are a few teachers out there that teach this, congratulations, you're doing great. But generally, the majority are not teaching this the way it needs to be taught for that lower 1/3 of students to learn how to read. So I started learning Chinese, and it shocked me. After about 4 or 5 days, I learned every phonogram in Chinese, or alphabet, you could say, the Bapa Mafa, and I could read every word in Chinese. I could read every word. I didn't understand what every word meant, or character, but right down the side of every character, there'd be 1 or 2 or 3 symbols, and then all you have to do is know all the symbols, and you can just read it every time. Very easy. That's why kids in Asian countries who have these kind of alphabets are incredible readers at the elementary level compared to us over here in North America. So this kind of bothered me for a long time, and I continued on teaching, and I started looking into books on how to teach English, how to understand English, and it took me a few years, but I finally found a book called The Logic of English. I read this book, and as soon as I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. It explained everything that was always on my mind about English. And it reminded me of being in elementary school when I had these questions, and I would ask a teacher, "Teacher, why is blah, blah, blah like this?" And they would say, "Oh, that's an exception," or "That's just the way it is." There's almost no words in English like that, even though people say it all the time. I'll give you an example. An early word that kids always learn is like ocean. O-C-E-A-N. C-E says sh in ocean and crustacean. It's extremely rare. And if a teacher doesn't explain that right away, the kid can get quite confused whenever they see that word. They have a whole system. They have about 74 regular phonograms. I went through all those phonograms and studied my butt off for months to make sure I had them inside and out. And they also have about 30 plus rules in English. And I before E except after C is not one of them. Neither is when one vowel goes a walking, the first one, when two vowels go a walking, the first one does a talking. Those are garbage. Those are too simplistic and they don't explain anything. So once you learn all the basic phonograms and then the spelling rules, things start opening up when you read. You start noticing things and you start getting better at reading. And not only that, but you can start, once you start learning about morphology and other things, you can start picking out words that you've never seen before, and you have a good idea of what they mean, which is where you want to be as a reader, which is awesome. So I learned all about the logic of English. I started becoming a better reader. Then I started teaching it to my students. And after I started kind of getting into teaching that, I had no students with any reading problems, no issues. I was lucky because usually about 1 or 2% will always have reading issues, the science tells us. But I was really lucky for that. I left Taiwan and went over to Alberta to make some more money because I still had to pay back these exuberant student loans from university where I didn't really learn very much. Another pet peeve, maybe my own fault. Anyways, went to Alberta, got into scaffolding. Every year I would kind of work in Alberta for half the year, go back to Taiwan and do some subbing teaching or vacation or see my family. So when I was working in Alberta, and I worked with a lot of other people, I became a journeyman scaffolder, and I'd be kind of running crews for a while, and I noticed something in Alberta. Now, statistically, they say that about 1/3 of North American English speakers have a real issue with reading. Well, I was running into a population where about half had a real hard time with reading and writing, because before every job we do, we have to fill out a FLHA, like a safety sheet, and sometimes I'd be in a truck, I'd turn around to give it to one of the apprentices, and I had to fill it out. Now, I didn't want to say anything, make them upset, because I know how they feel, because I was exactly like that. And it was really hard to talk to them about this, not that I was trying. A few people I had good chats with this about. But I knew they could learn how to read, but they couldn't. And because they couldn't, I feel like they weren't they couldn't become the person they needed to be, in life. I felt like with people that can't read, and I know this is how I felt, they get upset quicker. If they're questioned on intelligence or anything, they can blow up easier. I will say this is my own theory, but I feel like they're more apt to become inclined to drink the alcohol or do drugs. I really feel that, because living with a shame like that and feeling you're not as whole really pushes you into those the corners in life. So anyway, I did scaffolding for all those years, went back to Taiwan, did some sub-teaching, and then scaffolding is really tough on your body, so it's not all altruistic, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to go back and do my Bachelor of Education, and I'm going to be a teacher because I can already teach reading great, and I do love teaching better than grunting up the scaffolding and building scaffolds. So I went back to do my Bachelor of Education, and I was nervous. I was really nervous because I got that feeling that I always had throughout my life where I felt like, oh, maybe I will not be smart enough. Can I do this? Something that reoccurs in a brain of somebody who couldn't read for most of their life. Lo and behold, though, it was all quite easy. I had a couple great courses. Math, I learned a lot of stuff in math. It was amazing. STEM and science. But as far as the other courses, I could have really have done without, and I felt pretty upset by the whole experience. So much so, I used to end up at a bar all by myself called The Hills and having a few beer in the evenings and playing a little pool. The course almost turned me into an alcoholic, but I got out of there finally. Graduated. So the literacy teachers thought they knew what they were teaching. It's funny because they thought they were really great at teaching literacy. But because I was in the class and I would kind of like battle them a little bit, it became quite apparent that all they did was stick to make kids love reading, push reading on them. This is Lucy Calkins. She should be, taught in the schools, which I do not agree with. But there was no explicit systematic phonetic instruction. So you put me in there, who's a cunning linguist. If you put me in there and I have to listen to these people, it's really hard because I understand what's going on. I kind of want to take over and like explain to the students, but they're being taught not well how to teach. They all repeated the same I before E except after C, when two vowels go a walking, the same one does the first one does a talking, and things about Lucy Calkins, which is not really helpful for reading at all. I went through the whole year and I got kind of frustrated because after I went up to my first practicum, I was in the school system and I ran into a lot of kids that were having trouble reading. Now, they shouldn't have had trouble reading, but they just weren't learning properly. They were that bottom 1/3 of students. So I started kind of pushing back against the administration, and I talked to the administration. I said, you sent all the elementary school teachers out without teaching them even how to teach the ABCs. And the administration was like, that's ridiculous. We taught that. I said, no, you didn't, because I was in the class. And then they said, well, they'll learn that on the job. And I go, no, they won't, because currently all the teachers that I observed in other schools aren't really teaching things properly. And I was kind of brushed off. So I was kind of annoyed at this. And then we went to a teachers conference. I met a guy, the education minister, and I set up a meeting with him. A couple weeks later, I go down and I have a meeting with him and I tell him the whole story. I was pretty lucky to get that meeting, and he was pretty shocked about what I was telling him because he didn't know any of this. He was a lawyer by trade. Great guy, handsome to boot. Anyways, he didn't really know what to do with me, so he set me up to meet with someone in the teachers union. So the next week I went down to a very awkward meeting, which it turned out to be, where I explained my story to someone within teachers union, and they seen where I was coming from, and they placated me a bit, and it got awkward, and they were more defensive than I feel like they should have been, and they weren't taking my advice at all. You see, what happened was the teachers unions, in the Maritime provinces at least, they went whole hand in with this writing Lucy Calkins kind of a program where they have a lot of writing teachers that go out and they help teachers coach them how to make better writers. That's great, but you're kind of like putting the cart before the horse. You need to teach them to read first. So what they should have done, and what the science tells, is that kids first need to learn how to read and write well, and then you can jump into writing. So they're doing everything backwards, and they didn't even know it. How could they know it? They were in the 2/3, right? They didn't understand it. And they think that whole language is the way kids learn how to read because they're not even teaching properly. Anyways, I digress. So after the meeting, I kind of got a little scared because I was worried about my degree being in jeopardy. So I kind of like piped down a bit, just got through it all. And I talked to it with a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, and like a lot of people know there's a problem. They just can't change it. So like what I'm trying to say is that in the unions won't change it. And the Minister of Education is beholden to the unions. They're always working with them, right? And they'll just listen to the unions. But the people at the top of the unions don't know what they're doing. I've met many administrators that don't know what they're doing, and many teachers that have a really hard time in the classrooms because they don't know what they're doing. So what they need to do is what I've already said first. We need to get the parents to actually push on them to be retrained. The province that I was in, they actually were going to start retraining teachers, but they were going to start at grade 6. They should have started down at primary to grade 1 and give them all that systematic, explicit phonetic instruction. So anyways, I finished the meeting, never really said much more than that, receded, and now I'm going to run for federal office. And here's what I want to do. And like I said, this is not a federal issue. I want to, when I win the election, which I plan on winning, I want to actually I'm not going to run off to Ottawa. I'm going to stay here in Central Nova, and I'm going to make sure that every administrator, that every teacher knows what's going on within the school system. I'm going to have them all listen to that podcast and all look into the logic of English training, because that's my favorite. There are other ones. Louisa Moats is one. She has a bunch of training out there. Debbie Happlethry. There's a lot of people out there that know what's going on, and they have programs out there. So I'm going to stay in, and I'm going to make sure that they all know, and I'm going to really push this, because within 4 or 5 years, our reading literacy rate could skyrocket right to the top if we push this. We should be pushing it Canadian-wide, but I think it'll be actually quite tough to make inroads over there right now. So let's do it here first. Central Nova. Let's make us the best reading constituency out there. It's not that hard. The training is not too vigorous. It just takes a little while and a good understanding of how reading works. So that's what I'm proposing for my first video. I hope I didn't ramble on too much or waste your time. And for anyone that takes offense or whatever, I don't really care. But I'm not trying to be mean or malicious. I'm just telling you like it is. My life has, the happiness in my life has greatly increased since I've been able to read, and I'm not as embarrassed about my reading, and I can get up and write things, right? And we should give that to everyone. We should give everyone a chance, I'm not sure I already mentioned this, but just facts about reading. Do you know in America that about 80% of the inmates are illiterate? Right? That's a road that people travel down when they can't read. It's one of the avenues. It's one of the easier avenues they travel down. And I'm sure it's similar in Canada. Probably not as high, but it'll be up there. So let's make a big change. Get out there, talk about this video. You can make fun of me and all that. I'm pretty good with that. I don't care. But talk to other parents. Talk to people who have trouble reading. And listen to that podcast. Look at the Logic of English on YouTube. The podcast, Hard Words. Why aren't kids being taught to read? Remember it. It's the best podcast that you'll ever watch for reading. I hope this is well received, and we can all do a little better. For parents, don't be too hard on the teachers because they weren't trained properly and they don't know. And for parents, stop sending your schools to kid with all that junk. The lunches in schools these days, my goodness. I know it's tough, but it's a lot of sugar I see in those classrooms. I think we can do a little better than that. All right, so get ready for my next video, because if this didn't make you upset, the next one might. All right, vote Shad, independent.